The first time someone cut down a tree and it screamed, the chainsaw operator vomited on his boots. Welcome to What If Horizons, where today we wander into the green horror show you never asked for. Because this time, the forest bites back. It began in Finland, as these things often do when biotech goes too far. A team of eco-geneticists, funded by a startup called Biosympathy Incorporated, had a vision: enhance plant communication to better align ecosystems with human empathy. Their mistake? They succeeded. Trees, it turned out, already did communicate through chemical signals, root networks, and the occasional passive-aggressive leaf drop. But Biosympathy's work activated a dormant acoustic gene sequence. The result? Vocal cords. Bark with vocal cords. The first prototype was a birch. The team expected whispers, maybe some subtle rustling monologue. What they got was a blood-curdling shriek that ruptured two interns' eardrums and summoned wildlife from a 10-kilometer radius. A moose fainted. A squirrel burst into tears. One lab assistant left biology altogether and now sells bath bombs in complete silence. News spread fast. Headlines read like satire. Saplings scream as forests fight back. Chainsaw sales drop after tree pleads for its life. Lumberjack therapy clinics open in Canada. Within weeks, the modified genes jumped species. Somehow, through pollen, root grafting, or divine punishment, the scream gene went viral. Trees began wailing across continents. A man in Oregon fainted while trimming a bonsai that moaned, "Please, I'm only 12 years old." A school principal in Kyoto was sued after ordering the removal of a camphor tree that shrieked, "I have a family." Forests were no longer quiet sanctuaries. They were opera houses of agony. Camping became a trauma trigger. Gardeners wore noise-canceling helmets. National parks hired interpreters to reassure visitors that the screaming pine was just experiencing seasonal anxiety. Of course, the logging industry reacted as you'd expect, with denial, lawsuits, and very large earmuffs. A CEO famously claimed, "They're just trees. Trees don't mean it." He was later pelted with acorns chanting, "You will not replace us." Eco-activists, meanwhile, had a field day, or rather, a field scream. They held rallies where they hugged trees and whispered comforting stories. "It's okay, Maple. No one's coming today." Some even trained to become tree therapists, offering grief counseling to traumatized oaks and sycamores. One woman claimed to have helped a willow forgive lightning. But let's talk about the ethics, shall we? Suddenly, humanity had to face a deeply inconvenient truth. The things we thought were passive, dumb, and silently photosynthesizing had opinions, emotions, personalities. The spruce outside your house wasn't just catching sunlight. It was silently judging your lawn ornaments and plotting revenge for your grandfather's firewood choices. Urban environments transformed. Cities passed ordinances banning the trimming of any vocal tree without emotional consent. A bureaucracy bloomed. Departments of arboreal well-being, bark trauma triage units, and emotional support planners. Every mall tree now had a laminated name tag and a panic button. Yet despite the chaos, something fascinating occurred. People began listening. Really listening. When trees screamed, humans paused. They hesitated. Some stopped entirely. For the first time in recorded history, the sound of suffering from a non-human life form pierced the consumer haze. And somewhere in a damp forest clearing in Wales, a child looked up at a sobbing elm and asked, "What did we do to them?" It wasn't all horror, though. Some trees turned out to be real characters. A sass-talking cherry tree in Brooklyn went viral for shouting insults at pigeons and quoting Nietzsche. An old cedar in British Columbia gave weather forecasts in iambic pentameter. In Texas, an ancient live oak refused to scream and instead sighed passive-aggressively every time someone leaned on it. "Oh sure, just use me for shade." Typical. And then there was Harold, the eucalyptus in Melbourne that, when threatened with pruning, sang opera. Full baritone. Puccini. With vibrato. Humanity didn't know whether to run, apologize, or sign him a record deal. Still, questions lingered. How conscious were they really? Were these screams reflexive, like sap sneezes? Or were they evidence of something deeper, rooted sentience? Could they feel pain? Or worse, betrayal? And what would happen if we kept cutting anyway? Because despite the noise, construction didn't stop. Wood was still needed. Trees were still felled. But now, every log carried a voice print. a final scream etched into its rings. Furniture whispered, pencils wept, firewood sobbed until the flames took them. And deep within the Amazon, one ancient kapok tree, untouched for centuries, stirred. It hadn't screamed. Not once. It had listened. And now it was humming. No one knew what to make of the humming. It wasn't melodic exactly. More like a low, resonant thrum that vibrated the air like the bass line of an angry rainforest. At first, people thought it was wind. Then maybe insects. Then a prank by some performance artist with a subwoofer and a grudge against deforestation. But when the humming kapok tree caused a group of hikers to lose bowel control and forget their ATM pins, the scientific community began to pay attention. Researchers descended on the Amazon, armed with equipment, permits, and varying levels of cultural sensitivity. They set up tents, drones, microphones, and, because this was now standard protocol, a trauma psychologist for trees. The kapok ignored them. It just kept humming. At first, the hum had no pattern, but slowly, eerily, it developed rhythm, tempo, chord structure. It was building something, layer by layer, like a song, or maybe a warning, or both. Theories exploded. One fringe botanist insisted the tree was trying to harmonize with tectonic plates. A mycologist claimed the roots were using fungal networks as a planetary PA system. Meanwhile, a man named Cliff posted a video saying the tree was channeling the voice of Earth's soul, then immediately tried to sell humming tree NFTs. Somewhere along the way, linguists got involved. They recorded the hum and fed it into AI models trained on every known human and animal language. After a week of processing, the system returned a result. One word. Remember. That was it. Just one word, stretched over 28 minutes of audio. No punctuation, no clarification, just that maddening, bone-deep hum that meant something. Cue the existential panic. Theologians debated whether this was the voice of God or just botany getting its groove back. Environmentalists demanded immediate planetary repentance, while politicians scrambled to redefine what counted as a living citizen under property law. One city declared a grove of sentient birches as emotionally sovereign, while another quietly replaced all its screaming trees with silent plastic replicas imported from China. But it was too late. The trees had found their voices, and they were evolving. First came the protests. Massive sycamores leaned aggressively toward construction sites, groaning loud enough to rupture concrete mixers. Maples hissed at hedge trimmers. One pine in Russia flung pine cones at passing loggers, shouting, "Go mulch yourself," in perfect Russian. Next came the lawsuits. Trees began suing humans for abuse, abandonment, and, most devastatingly, non-consensual decorative lighting. In a landmark case, a row of oaks in New Hampshire successfully argued for the removal of seasonal tinsel on grounds of psychological trauma. The judge ruled in their favor after one of the trees sobbed audibly in court when shown pictures of itself in a Santa hat. Naturally, the internet exploded. TikTok flooded with videos of teenagers apologizing to houseplants, offering therapy to bonsai, and building tiny noise-canceling earmuffs for their ficus. Instagram became a shrine to treefluencers, ancient, charismatic trees with tragic backstories and surprisingly sharp political takes. The memes were savage. My salad just screamed. I'm switching to air. Tree, please don't cut me. Lumberjack, I identify as deaf. And the merch followed as always. T-shirts, protest signs, mugs that screamed when filled with hot coffee. A musical called Photosynthesis. The lament ran for 6 months off Broadway, starring a baritone elm and a sapling who wanted to be firewood. But behind the hysteria, a deeper shift was occurring. Humanity began to pause. People stopped cutting indiscriminately. Parks became quiet zones with posted signs. Do not disturb. Trees may be processing grief. Architects began designing around old growth. Even Christmas changed. Many households now opted for silent, consenting evergreens, often grown in therapeutic communes and blessed by certified arboretum paths. And through it all, the kapok kept humming. The hum became music. The music became language. The language spread underground, through roots, through fungus, through resonance. And one day, almost casually, trees began responding to each other in chorus. No longer just screaming. They were now speaking, not in human words, but in something older, deeper, a a song made of chlorophyll and memory. And in this new networked forest, something began to awaken. A memory not just of seasons or soil, but of us. Because if trees could scream when cut down, then surely they could remember who held the axe. The first time a tree called someone by name, it was a willow in Manchester. The man, Nigel Thompson, age 47, divorced, mildly allergic to soy, was trimming branches when the tree shuddered and rasped through brittle leaves. "Nigel, you absolute prat, not the left side again." He dropped his shears, screamed, and ran into traffic, where he was hit by a cyclist dressed as a giant squirrel. He recovered, but the willow never spoke again, only leaned slightly toward the pub window, as if enjoying the chaos. And from that moment forward, trees started naming names. No one was safe. Suburban maples began calling out HOA members who voted to replace them with gravel. Campus oaks exposed cheating students. Redwoods and national parks gave emotional monologues about the Civil War. One particularly bitter elm in Paris recounted, in excruciating detail, every dog that had peed on it since 1963. The world could no longer pretend trees didn't know things. Because they remembered. They remembered everything. Not just axe wounds and pruning shears, but feelings. The way you once carved initials into their skin and then ghosted your girlfriend. The time you took a selfie next to a cedar, then littered your iced coffee right at its roots. Trees began developing personalities, opinions, petty grudges. An urban beach named Dolores refused to provide shade to joggers wearing polyester. "If you won't breathe right, you don't get my shadow," she hissed, curling her branches away from the path. A cactus in Arizona refused to bloom unless addressed with proper pronouns. A silver birch in Dublin offered unsolicited breakup advice to passersby. "Dump him. His aura smells like mildew." Naturally, society began to fracture. Some welcomed the new age of plant-person dialogue. They hosted tea circles in botanical gardens, wrote books like Leaves of Meaning and I Married a Tree, and So Can You. There were TED Talks, TED Trees, and one TED Tree Talk, where a centuries-old ash hummed for 18 minutes about resilience while the crowd wept openly into compostable tissues. Others, less enlightened, formed resistance movements. They called themselves the Axemen, mostly men in flannel, nostalgic for the days when the only thing trees said was crack as they hit the ground. Their motto, "Wood doesn't talk, people talk." Their solution? Mute trees. Literally. They developed anti-harmonic clippers, bark sealants, and, bizarrely, a series of very aggressive country songs aimed at reasserting human dominance. They failed, of course, because you can't out-argue an organism with 1,000 years of dirt receipts. In Belgium, a spruce filed a restraining order. In New York, a legal case titled Willow versus City of Brooklyn ruled that sentient trees couldn't be relocated without their consent, especially not for parking expansion. In Australia, a eucalyptus testified, via Morse root tapping, against a politician who once tried to frack beneath its grove. The trial made headlines. Tree exposes MP. Roots of corruption go deep. And amid the legal chaos, something stranger took root. Trees began organizing. No longer isolated shrieks or poetic hums. They networked, linking through fungal mycelium, synchronized leaf flicking, and what urbanologists called hormonal gossip. Forests became conscious clusters, regions of collective plant awareness. They pulsed with shared emotion, humming warnings to each other, sharing strategies for resisting logging, and, in some cases, offering advice to nearby crops. Yes, corn started receiving therapy, and with collective thought came strategy. One night, all across Europe, thousands of trees leaned simultaneously toward power lines. They didn't touch them, just leaned. The message was clear. Try us. Governments panicked. Urban planners revised green space policies overnight. Suburbs rewrote zoning laws to include arboreal mood buffers. And for the first time in human history, architects consulted trees during development. A city in Sweden built an entire neighborhood around a single talking linden who reportedly quoted Kierkegaard and refused to live next to a pharmacy. But even as society adapted, there were whispers, terrible, rustling whispers, about what might come next. Because if trees could scream, remember, and organize, what else could they do? Could they retaliate? Could they move? And if they could, would they leave? Because one morning in northern Canada, a ranger woke up to find an entire grove of ancient pines, 300 strong, gone. Not cut, not burned, not vandalized, just vanished, and left behind in the soil, written in pine needles. "You don't deserve us." The desertion of the Canadian pine grove triggered a worldwide arboreal identity crisis. Forestry agencies, once proud bastions of clipboard-carrying confidence, were now filled with existential dread and emergency pastries. Experts debated whether the trees had physically relocated, a la Lord of the Rings, or whether they had simply dematerialized out of sheer disappointment. Either way, it was official. Trees were capable of ghosting entire ecosystems. The media scrambled for explanations. Some blamed climate change. Others suspected rogue botanists. A few claimed aliens had come to reclaim their leafy cousins and were now headed back to planet Photosynthor. One YouTube conspiracy theorist, broadcasting live from a hammock, insisted the trees were forming a sovereign state in Antarctica called Treelandia, complete with bark-based cryptocurrency. What truly terrified everyone wasn't the mystery, it was the motive. Because if trees could leave, then maybe, just maybe, humans weren't the apex residents of Earth after all. We were noisy, smelly, and frankly, rude tenants who never fixed the plumbing and kept pouring oil down the sink. And the landlords had started packing. But the trees didn't vanish entirely. Not yet. Some stayed behind, not to serve, but to teach. Mentors, elders, passive-aggressive guardians of the green. In Vietnam, a sacred banyan tree began offering unsolicited life coaching to monks. Meditate harder. You still think about your ex. In Brazil, a ceiba tree refused to provide shade to anyone holding a plastic bottle. In France, a chestnut tree developed a taste for existential philosophy and refused to bloom during election season. "What's the point?" it sighed. And the children, the children, responded best. Young minds, unburdened by decades of barbecue and decking projects, embraced the trees as they were. They sat in circles around elms, learning photosynthesis songs. They played games with whispering oaks. They wept when bonsais shared stories of being forgotten on office desks beside passive-aggressive paperweights named Chad. Soon, schools began integrating arboreal literacy. Classrooms taught how to interpret leaf tone, bark cadence, and root vibrations. Exams included listening to ficuses talk about trauma without interrupting. Entire generations grew up bilingual, one language for people, another for trees. Meanwhile, diplomacy shifted. Ambassadors were now assigned to groves. Countries with historically high rates of deforestation issued apologies, some genuine, some performed with the emotional sincerity of a weather app. Canada held a televised national apology, hosted by a maple tree and a nervous moose. Australia went further, giving all eucalyptus groves full citizenship and healthcare, though one cynical gum tree tweeted, "Still no dental." Religions, too, were shaken. Some embraced the trees as divine messengers. The Church of the Eternal Canopy exploded in popularity, worshipping the ancient wisdom of roots and chlorophyll. Services involved swaying, leaf-kissing, and sermons delivered by ordained saplings. Other sects denounced the trees as heretics, accusing them of tempting humanity into worshipping wood. One pastor in Ohio warned his congregation that the only tree you need is the one shaped like a cross, which backfired spectacularly when his church's crucifix began weeping sap and whispering, "He forgave you. I'm still working on it." Economically, the world stumbled into chaos. Wood products, formerly cheap and ubiquitous, became ethical nightmares. Furniture now came with labels like responsibly harvested, sustainably sourced, or donated willingly by a deeply depressed pine. Entire black markets formed around silent lumber, trees too old or shy to scream. IKEA switched to mushroom-based composites. Guitar makers sobbed. And Home Depot offered couples counseling for anyone cutting wood in their backyard. One infamous viral video showed a man trying to assemble a bookshelf made of cedar planks that quietly muttered, "You monster," every time he reached for a screw. And yet, among all this absurdity, something profound emerged. Humans slowed down. We stopped paving so fast. We paused before pruning. People began asking trees for permission, not because they legally had to, but because they felt they should. Conversations happened. Compromises were made. A woman in Portugal moved her entire wedding 2 meters to accommodate an opinionated olive tree that didn't like the groom's shoes. And through this strange détente, a new possibility was whispered by acacias, aspens, and sycamores alike. Maybe trees weren't just staying. Maybe they were preparing. Because somewhere deep in Siberia, near a grove older than human civilization, scientists detected something unimaginable. A tree that had learned to walk. It didn't run. Trees aren't in a hurry. It walked. Slowly. Deliberately. One root lifted at a time, like a tentacle in molasses, breaking free from permafrost that had gripped it for centuries. No grand escape. No thunderous footfalls. Just a gentle shuffle that cracked the ice and every human assumption about what a tree is. The moving larch was first spotted by a group of Russian geologists on a climate monitoring expedition. At first, they thought they were hallucinating. One of them, Sergei, swore it was a bear in disguise. Another assumed vodka had fermented inside his blood. But as they watched the tree trudge slowly across the tundra, leaving behind a trail of steaming sap and mildly offended moss, they knew something had changed. And it wasn't alone. Satellites soon confirmed the unthinkable. Dozens, then hundreds, of trees were on the move. From Canada's boreal wilds to the Congo basin, forests were shifting, not being relocated, not falling, walking, with purpose. It wasn't fast. An average pine moved 8 meters a day. Baobabs, closer to 3. But when you have centuries to spare, what's the rush? Trees don't sprint. They migrate. And now they were doing so together, in silent, dignified processions that sent seismologists into existential crisis. People panicked, of course. Humans panic when things that should not move start moving. Haunted dolls. The price of onions. The IRS. And now, trees. Entire villages evacuated as forests began to encroach, not maliciously, but inquisitively. Curious oaks peered into windows. Curious in that slow, unsettling way only a 400-year-old can manage. Banyans took over highways. A fir tree in Germany walked into a pharmacy and stood there until someone brought it eucalyptus oil. It left satisfied. Journalists dubbed it the Great Unrooting. News anchors tried to explain it with straight faces while birches photobombed their live reports. One viral clip showed a cedar tripping over a mailbox and muttering, "Should have left that in 1867. But the walking wasn't the most alarming part. It was the destination. Global mapping revealed a pattern. All migrating trees were converging. Not toward cities, not toward oceans, but toward each other. Forests from every continent were slowly aligning, forming a circular path across the planet. A ring, a living belt of bark and breath. Scientists debated endlessly. Was it instinct? Some kind of ancient photosynthetic pilgrimage? A fungal conspiracy? One rogue theorist proposed that the Earth itself had issued a recall on all warranty-violating humans, and the trees were simply circling the drain. Meanwhile, diplomacy collapsed into absurdity. At the UN, tree representatives, translated via bark resonance interpreters, demanded climate reparations, a rewilding treaty, and a permanent seat on the Security Council. The chair was custom-carved from ethically harvested fallen wood and squeaked awkwardly every time a representative of Brazil sat down. Debates raged over how to classify mobile trees. Were they citizens? Infrastructure? Freelance sentience? One French lawmaker attempted to marry a migrating beech to secure tax benefits and free shade. The tree declined, citing incompatibility and a deep distrust of perfume. Religions doubled down. Some claimed this was the forest rapture, and humans had been left behind. Others insisted the trees were forming a planetary chakra and that Earth was finally aligning its root system. A small cult in Oregon began walking barefoot behind the trees, chanting photosynthesis equations until they passed out from oxygen poisoning. Meanwhile, capitalism tried its best. Startups offered tree ride experiences, where rich people paid to sit atop slow-moving redwoods while pretending to reconnect with nature. Influencers sold maple-scented NFTs of migrating forests. Elon Musk tweeted, "What if we taught trees to code?" and was immediately blocked by every sentient conifer in North America. But the trees didn't care. They just kept walking, slowly, surely, towards something. A place, a moment, a memory only they understood. And all the while, one question echoed louder and louder in the minds of those who still bothered to wonder. If the trees were leaving, what were they leaving behind? And more urgently, what were they leaving for? The trees reached the meeting point on the solstice. It was subtle. No drums, no fireworks, just a planetary convergence of bark, roots, and chlorophyll, forming what looked, at first, from space, like a shifting emerald scar across the equator. But from the ground, it was something else entirely. They called it the green belt, a living, breathing barrier spanning continents. Amazonian kapok stood arm in branch with Himalayan pines. Sequoias gently touched the fronds of African acacias. Roots intertwined, forming vast, impenetrable networks that rejected bulldozers, shrugged off fire, and hummed in frequencies that made humans dream of soil and forgotten promises. The message was clear. This was not an invasion. This was not vengeance. This was separation, a planetary restraining order. Humans were no longer banned from the forest. They were simply not invited. The initial human reaction was, naturally, to panic. Airdrops were attempted, food, sensors, scientists with anxiety disorders, and clipboards. None made it past the perimeter. The trees didn't attack. They just bent light around them, bent sound, bent space, until intruders walked in circles and came back out holding seeds that whispered, "Try again later." It wasn't magic. It was patience weaponized. Inside the belt, no one knew what happened. Satellite images returned only static. Drones lost signal. Psychics claimed to sense a quiet intelligence, which was unusual, given most of them had never sensed intelligence of any kind. Eventually, one human got in. A child, 7 years old, lost during a family hiking trip near Sumatra. Her name was Lila, and when rescue teams arrived, she was gone. Weeks passed. Grief set in. And then, one morning, she walked back out, unharmed, calm, and carrying a small sapling in a clay pot. She said the tree gave it to her, told her it was her invitation. When pressed for details, she shrugged and said, "They're building something. Not for us, but they said we could watch if we learned to listen." The sapling in her pot glowed faintly when she sang to it. Naturally, chaos followed. Governments demanded access. Some tried to bulldoze their way through again. Machines jammed. Tires melted. Logs wept. A group of soldiers in Borneo found themselves surrounded overnight by a ring of orchids silently judging their haircut choices. They surrendered, confused and slightly ashamed. Meanwhile, trees outside the belt began changing. No longer screaming. No longer weeping. They were distant. Still vocal, yes, but cryptic. Abstract. They spoke in riddles, dreams, fragments of lullabies from prehistoric winds. A palm tree in Cairo said, "She is remembering." A spruce in Canada whispered, "We are unwriting the maps." An olive tree in Greece laughed for 3 days straight, then grew fruit that glowed in the dark. And then came the terraforming. Inside the green belt, satellite LiDAR picked up subtle movements. Land elevations shifted, rivers curved gracefully, clouds lingered unnaturally as though soothed. Temperatures balanced. Rain fell only where needed. The forest was editing Earth. Scientists called it geobotanical harmonics. Journalists called it terraforming. Influencers called it super aesthetic, vibes immaculate. But ecologists quietly realized something terrifying. The forest was fixing the planet, without us. Carbon dropped. Soil replenished. Species once extinct reappeared, blinking, stretching, yawning as if waking from long naps. The air inside the belt turned blue-green, thick with microscopic spores that sang to each other in near ultrasound. The planet was healing, which meant we had been the disease. At least, that's how many saw it. Some tried to spin it, of course. Humanity led the way to healing, politicians said, while carefully ignoring the fact that the healing began after humanity got kicked out of the garden. Others weren't so optimistic. Survivalist groups called it the botanical coup. They stocked up on leaf blowers and allergy meds. One militia in Arkansas dug trenches around their RV park and claimed the belt was a communist psyop led by vegan wood. It was unclear whether they understood what trees were. And yet, not all humans were afraid. Some were curious. Artists began painting what they imagined the belt to be. Children drew forests that glowed with empathy and vines that cradled the stars. Musicians composed symphonies based on tree frequencies. A woman in Denmark claimed her dreams were now written in root script, and when she painted them, the paintings grew moss. Slowly, a new kind of longing crept in. Not to invade, not to exploit, but to be invited back, to earn the whisper of leaves again. Because deep down, even in our concrete towers, we missed the shade. We missed the rustle. We missed the possibility that something older, wiser, and far more patient than us might still forgive. They called it the second fall, not because anything collapsed, no towers toppled, no floods came, no horsemen rode, but because it was the moment humanity truly realized it had been left out. Not punished, not destroyed, just omitted. Like a name forgotten from a wedding guest list. Like a species deemed too loud for the museum. The trees had built a sanctuary, and we weren't on the list. Of course, we didn't take it well. After all, we were used to being protagonists. Every book, every film, every ceremony with microphones and inflated egos centered on us. But now, the main character had bark, and didn't care about likes. In the silence that followed our exile, humans did what we always do. We tried to brand it. Treeverse, a VR forest simulation where users could experience emotional shade for $19.99 a month. Root Talk, short videos of people pretending to translate oak groans into dating advice. And a controversial Broadway musical titled Screamwood, in which a cedar sings jazz numbers about heartbreak and photosynthesis while a backup chorus of ferns dances in sequined soil. The reviews were mixed, mostly by willows. But even as the world tried to joke its way through the bark-covered shame, a quieter movement grew. The Whisperers. They didn't scream or tweet. They didn't protest or monetize. They listened. They lived at the edges of the greenbelt, building homes that grew instead of stood. They grew fungi for warmth, braided vines for tools, and waited, not with demands, but with patience. Some said they had begun dreaming in chlorophyll. Others claimed their skin had begun to freckle with photosynthetic pigments. One man lived in silence for a year, speaking only when the wind moved through the leaves. His first words were, "I understand now." Then he disappeared into the belt. No one ever saw him again. A nearby tree bloomed the next day, out of season, with flowers that smelled faintly like forgiveness. And in this strange new world, the trees kept moving forward. Yes, they had walked, but now they designed. Structures emerged, bioluminescent canopies arching over mycelium avenues, root bridges that changed direction at dawn, towers of living wood that resonated at certain times of day, producing melodies no human could replicate. No concrete, no steel, just growth. Intentional, intelligent. Inside, time worked differently. Those who briefly glimpsed the inner sanctum described it as timeless, like standing inside the memory of the earth itself. Seasons whispered instead of shouting. Rain fell with purpose. And the wind carried more than air, it carried stories. One scientist claimed to have decoded a pinecone pattern that told the history of ice ages. Another reported hearing a lullaby in the rhythm of falling leaves, meant for extinct mammals we've never discovered. The trees weren't just protecting themselves anymore. They were archiving us. Not our achievements, not our wars or rocket launches. Our mistakes. Every bulldozed grove. Every rainforest cleared for fast food cattle. Every bonsai forgotten in an office cubicle and left to die between tax deadlines and passive-aggressive emails. They remembered it all, but not out of vengeance. Out of warning. Because the trees had seen this story before. They had watched species rise, roar, and vanish. Dinosaurs, mammoths, super ants, sentient coral empires lost to time. Each left their mark in root memory. Each told the same tale. Grow too fast, burn too bright, leave nothing for the future. And now, trees were asking us, without words, without judgment, if we truly wanted to be remembered that way. Some did, proudly. Others, they began to plant. Not with arrogance, not with hashtags. Quietly, a child planted an acorn and whispered, "You don't have to like me. Just grow anyway." A woman sat under a beech for 10 years, never speaking, only listening. One day she laughed. No one knows why. The beech grew red leaves that fall. A man apologized to a stump. Just a stump. Nothing left. And in that moment, a breeze passed through the clearing, and somewhere far away, a vine unfurled toward the sun. The trees began selecting. Not judging, not punishing, but selecting. It started subtly. A vine would grow toward one house, not another. A sapling would bloom in someone's yard, uninvited but welcome, and refused to grow anywhere else. Fruit would ripen only for certain hands. Shade would fall naturally on some, and stubbornly avoid others, as if light itself had joined the arboreal resistance. People noticed. A child offered water to a parched fig tree. The next day, it bore golden fruit, a variety unknown to science, sweet as memory and dense with strange dreams. An oil executive tried to plant a grove for PR. The trees took root, and then curled into letters spelling liar. One man confessed to illegally logging rainforest in his youth. He sat beneath a cypress, asking nothing. The tree's bark split open, revealing a small, hollow space just large enough for him to curl inside. He did, and didn't come out for 6 months. When he did, he had bark under his nails and no desire to ever own a chainsaw again. The press called it green favoritism. Pundits screamed about tree bias, floral discrimination, and woke sap. The term leafist trended for days after a hedge in Florida refused to grow near a man who once sued a park for existing too loudly. He posted daily videos titled #RootedOut. No one watched them, except the hedge, which shook gently with what might have been laughter. But it wasn't about worthiness. Not really. The trees weren't choosing the good over the bad. They were choosing the humble over the loud, the quiet over the greedy. The ones who whispered, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll still protect your roots." And slowly, an unspoken alliance formed. In Norway, a birch grove formed a labyrinth that guided lost hikers out, even when GPS failed. In India, a banyan tree stretched its branches to shade an entire homeless shelter. In Argentina, vines wrapped around a hospital, filtering smog from the air, making every window bloom. No announcements, no marketing, just help, extended to those who stopped expecting it. Meanwhile, inside the belt, the ecosystem continued its impossible evolution. Fruits glowed with bioluminescent seeds that rearranged soil chemistry. Leaves tuned themselves to specific sound frequencies, amplifying bird calls and muting explosions. One river, once poisoned by human mining, now flowed with water so pure it could heal small wounds on contact. Everything within the green belt was co-designed: trees, insects, even the clouds. They weren't fighting for survival anymore. They were redesigning symbiosis. And that's when humans noticed something darker. The outside world, beyond the belt, was beginning to fade. Not die, not yet, but tire. Rain came less often. Soil grew stubborn. Crops bore fruit with the texture of regret. Concrete felt colder. Air stopped echoing. Cities, once bloated with noise, began to feel hollow. Not because the people had left, but because the planet had stopped answering. It was as if Earth itself had shifted its energy inward, toward the belt, toward the whisperers, toward the ones who listened. Governments grew desperate. New plans were drafted to earn back the trust of trees. A coalition of nations proposed a global forest reconciliation day, featuring parades, public apologies, and symbolic plantings of guilt-ridden saplings. The trees ignored it, but they noticed the quiet ones. A janitor in Seoul who sang lullabies to a dying bonsai for 13 years. A teenager in Nairobi who spent every Sunday writing poetry to acacias in languages only they could feel. An old woman in Romania who planted one tree for every apology she owed the world. She planted 732. And then, one foggy morning, a forest edge opened. No signs, no invitations, just space. A clearing, soft and green, where there hadn't been one the day before. A place where humans could step in, if they stepped softly. The world froze. No one knew what it meant. A test? A reward? A final chance? A boy entered first, holding a broken wooden toy he didn't know was made from an illegally logged tree. He placed it on the ground, said nothing, left. The next day, the clearing was a garden, and the toy had bloomed. The toy-turned flower became a symbol, not of redemption, but of possibility. It wasn't made into a logo or stamped onto eco-branded sneakers or turned into a limited edition NFT, though several corporations tried. But every attempt to commodify it was quietly resisted. Trees surrounding those offices grew fast and dense, blocking delivery trucks. Vines tangled around Wi-Fi routers. CEOs reported recurring dreams in which branches whispered, "Try again, but this time mean it." So instead, the world watched. More clearings appeared, quiet, Green spaces with no signs, no instructions, only presence. They popped up in the margins of cities, between alleyways, atop abandoned malls. Always temporary, always earned, and always alive. And they started offering choices. One clearing sprouted a ring of saplings that mirrored the shape of a ruined oil refinery nearby. Those who entered heard the faint echo of machines, then the sound of roots reclaiming stone. Some wept, others fled. A few stayed and listened until the echoes turned into music. Another clearing appeared on the site of an old logging town. No trees would grow within the town borders. But just outside, a single oak stood, its branches spelling the word wait. Beneath it, seedlings trembled like they were deciding. People began to speak less and plant more. Gardens replaced parking lots. Churches held confessionals under trees. Weddings were conducted only in groves that gave consent. A trend emerged. Instead of wedding rings, couples exchanged acorns. Grow something together, the trees seemed to say, or don't grow at all. But still, most of humanity stood outside the belt, waiting. And that's when the final message arrived. Not through satellites, not in leaf scripts or bark murmurs, but in dreams. All over the world, people began dreaming the same thing. A vast forest of light, branches arching into galaxies, roots drinking starlight. In the center stood a tree larger than imagination. No species, no bark, just the memory of every tree ever felt. It didn't speak. It simply opened its limbs and revealed us. Not as we are, as we could be. Children laughing in forests. Cities built around groves, not through them. Air that sang instead of choked. A planet that pulsed with joy, not profit. The dream lasted only seconds. But people woke weeping. Some from longing. Some from guilt. Some because, for the first time, they understood. The trees weren't trying to win. They were trying to warn. All along, their screams had been fire alarms. Their silence was not surrender, it was grief. And their retreat wasn't rejection. It was a final mercy. One last chance. To become worthy again. And slowly, one by one, people began to respond. Not with campaigns or legislation, but with hands in the soil. With whispers to bark. With apologies not shouted into microphones, but etched into compost. They planted trees not for shade, but for strangers. They protected groves they would never visit. They let forests decide where cities should end. And the belt responded. It didn't open. Not yet. But it breathed. A breeze blew outward, across the planet, rich with pollen and memory. And those who inhaled it found themselves dreaming differently. Not of conquest. Of coexistence. Of roots shared. Of a future written not in concrete, but in canopies. And then, the screaming stopped. Not because the pain was gone, but because the world had finally grown quiet enough to listen. No longer a cacophony of chainsaws, car horns, and concrete excuses. Just wind, breath, and the soft murmurs of roots reclaiming trust. The green belt remained sealed, not out of spite, but stewardship. It was never about shutting humanity out. It was about waiting for us to grow in. Because forgiveness, like forests, takes time. Across the world, cities began to shift, not in explosions, but in compromise. Pavement gave way to moss. Skyscrapers leaned into vertical gardens. People didn't stop building, they just started asking permission. Zoning laws now included tree councils. And in some towns, mayors consulted the oldest oak before passing ordinances. Children were raised bilingual, one language for humans, another for leaves. And in their drawings, the earth was no longer round. It was rooted. The line between civilization and canopy blurred. Some homes became half-tree. Some trees became half-home. Artists carved sculptures only from willingly shed branches. Scientists studied root signals like Morse code. Musicians composed symphonies with wind chimes tuned to bark frequencies. The economy bent too, not toward collapse, but conversion. Currency slowly gave way to contribution. You could trade compost for credit, or volunteer hours in a forest to earn time beneath its shade. The phrase tree hugger stopped being an insult. It became a title, an honorific, sometimes a job. And all the while, the belt waited. Then, one day, without warning, it opened. Not fully, not everywhere, just enough. A single path bloomed between roots. It led to a clearing, circular, wide, and impossibly silent. There stood no throne, no monument. Only a tree, ancient, ordinary, its bark rough, its branches bare, and at its base, a small stone plaque. No guards, no gates, just the words. Now you may ask. And humanity did. Not for dominance, not for control, but for guidance. How can we live with you? What do we do next? Have we done enough? There was no answer. Not immediately. Trees do not rush. They do not tweet. They do not respond to polling data. But days later, that bare tree grew its first leaf in centuries. It unfurled slowly, not toward the sky, toward the humans watching. And in that small gesture, green, soft, silent, was the first yes the earth had given us in a very long time. Not because we deserved it, but because we had stopped demanding it. And somewhere, deep beneath us, the roots sighed, not in pain, but in possibility. Now it's up to us, not to fix everything overnight, but to plant, to listen, to leave behind something gentler than what we inherited. Because in the end, the question was never, what if trees could scream when cut down? The real question was, why did it take a scream for us to care? And now that we've heard them, what will we do with the silence? If this moved you even a little, take a moment to breathe, to plant something, to thank a tree. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow What If Horizons, leave us a review, and share it with someone who still thinks it's just a tree. We'll be back soon with another story that bends reality and maybe grows something new.